One of the things that I try to do on this channel is talk about some of the things that I see in my day job. And if you didn't know, I work as an application pen tester and I primarily focus on mobile applications. And one of the things that I've come across a few times recently is something that is pretty new, and that is GraphQL. Fortunately, PortSwigger has actually added a new section to the Web Security Academy recently that actually covers GraphQL and how to test some of those vulnerabilities. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about GraphQL, and I'm going to solve the first lab from the Web Security Academy under that topic. Naturally, the first question is, what is GraphQL? Well, according to PortSwigger, GraphQL is an API query language that is designed to facilitate efficient communication between clients and servers. The way I kind of think of it is sort of a combination of SQL and sort of a REST API. So it kind of behaves like a REST API, but it has a lot of the same structure as like a SQL query or something that you would see more with like a database. For example, here's a request and here's the corresponding response, and this request and response would actually be sent and received through an HTTP request. So you can actually capture this request with Burp Suite or some other proxy, and you can mess with these parameters through that instead of having to do some sort of like blind SQL injection or something like that to be able to mess with these parameters. So now that we have a basic understanding of what GraphQL is, let's get started on the first lab. And in this video, I'm just going to do this very first one, this apprentice level accessing private GraphQL posts. They have a few other labs that are a little bit more difficult, so I may end up going back and doing some of those in future videos. But for this video, I just wanted to give a little introduction to GraphQL and show some of the very basic things you can test for. So if we read the description of this lab, it says the blog page for this lab contains a hidden blog post that has a secret password. To solve the lab, find the hidden blog post and enter the password. So I'm going to access the lab, and I'm also going to launch Burp Suite. And then once Burp Suite opens, I'm going to go to the proxy tab and I'm going to open a browser within the Burp Suite session. And then I'm going to take the URL from that lab that opened in my Firefox browser and I'm going to paste it into this browser that I opened with Burp Suite. And now if I look at the HTTP history under my proxy, I'm seeing those requests that are being sent to the lab. And if I look at this request right here, I see that I have the GraphQL v1 endpoint. Since that's the URL that I want to play with, I'm going to right click it and I'm going to send to repeater. And if we look down in the body of the request, we see that there's this query parameter, and here we see that GraphQL query that they're sending, and that they're going to get all blog posts, and that's going to return all the blog posts that they want to display on the blog. And you'll also notice that Burp Suite actually automatically detects that this is a GraphQL request, and they actually have a new tab right here that says GraphQL view, so then you can actually take a look at the query by itself, and you don't have to worry about any formatting or like making sure you can understand everything that's happening. They put it in a pretty readable format for you. And one of the first things you can do when you have a GraphQL query, if you're on a pen test, the very first thing that I always look for is try to see if introspection is enabled. And again, Burp Suite offers a pretty convenient little feature. If you right click the request, there's this menu up here that says GraphQL, and you can click Set Introspection Query. And if we click on that, it automatically replaces the query with an introspection query. And this is actually a fairly new feature that they've added. I'm pretty sure that the first app that I tested when I first came across some GraphQL in an app I was working with, which wasn't that long ago, like probably within the last 6 months, I don't believe this feature existed. So I had to actually go look up what this query was and manually copy and paste it. So it's pretty convenient that now they actually have just like a right click and then it automatically fills in that query for you. But I'm just going to send it, and it returns the entire schema of the database. So if you were testing an app and this returned this schema like this for an app you were working with, in my opinion, this by itself is enough to be an actual security finding. Even if there was nothing else you found to actually exploit with the GraphQL query, I think that just having introspection enabled is enough to like put that on a pen test report. I would kind of put that on the same tier as like overly verbose error messages or stack traces or things like that. It's not a major finding by itself, but it's definitely against best security practices and could be useful for attackers for like larger attacks. And if we scroll down through this response to that introspection query, we see that there's actually an entry called post password. And since our objective for this lab was to find a hidden blog post that has a secret password, that is most likely going to be the parameter that we're going to need to find. But now we need to actually find that hidden post. And if we look back at our initial query before we sent that introspection query, we see that we have all these blog posts that are returned, and each of them have a different ID. So we have ID 1, 2, 5, and 4, and we're clearly missing ID 3. So that's probably going to be the hidden post that we need. So if we go back to our browser and we actually look at one of the individual posts, so we look at this first one and click view post. Now if we go back to our proxy tab and look at the HTTP history, now we see that we have this request right here that got a specific blog post. So again, let's right click that and send to repeater. And if we click send, we get that full content of that blog post. And if we click the GraphQL tab, we see that there is an ID equal to 1, and there are all these fields for the query. And because we think that there is a hidden post with ID equal to 3, I'm going to go down to the variables tab and I'm going to change ID 1 to ID 3. And because with that introspection query, we were able to find that hidden parameter for post password, I'm going to add a field for post password. And now I'm going to send that request and see what happens. So it did return the contents of this other blog post that was not available in the original website that we looked at. And if we look down at the bottom, there is actually a new parameter for post password. And if we copy that text right there, we can go back to our original browser session in Firefox, and there's this button at the top that says submit solution. And if we click that, there's a box that pops up for the answer, and we can paste it, click OK, and congratulations, you solved the lab. So this was a very simple lab. It just introduced a few basic concepts of testing GraphQL vulnerabilities. But I think the most important thing to take away from this is, one, how to do an introspection query, because I feel like that is like the most basic first thing you should look for anytime you come across a GraphQL endpoint. If they have introspection enabled, then you can immediately report that. That's a very easy thing to check for, and it is worth calling out in a pen test report, in my opinion. And once you get the response to that introspection query, then you can look through all the response data and see if there's any sort of parameters or anything that are a little bit unusual or look like they might contain some security sensitive data. And if so, then you can try messing with some of those other requests that you see going to that GraphQL endpoint, and then you can add those fields to some of your requests and see if anything interesting comes back. I just thought GraphQL was a fairly new thing that I've started seeing in some of the apps that I've tested, and maybe other people are seeing that as well. And I haven't seen a lot of content or resources about testing GraphQL yet, so I thought maybe I would cover a few basic things and maybe it would help others. And if there's interest, maybe I'll do some of the more advanced labs on GraphQL as well, and I'll make those in a future video. So if that interests you, let me know and I'll see what I can do in the future.